All right, guys, thank you so much for continuing in our Seeing Through Gebser series. This is a very special video today. We are on page 188 of this edition of Jean Gebser's The Ever-Present Origin. Why is this video special today? Because we are moving on to a new section, and a very interesting one at that. So for the next 3-4 videos, maybe even more or less, we will be talking about, this section is called On the History of the Phenomena of Soul and Spirit. So, going to be some interesting stuff. Um, the only thing that I would want to impress upon you as we go through this section, excuse me, is please try to bracket or set aside your rational spatialization. The operative word there being spatialization. Spatialization requires measurability, and a lot of that's not going to be here. A lot of this is quantifiably immeasurable. So if you worry that you're not getting a good grasp, a rational grasp on this, that's the whole point. You're supposed to get the picture of it, get the idea, take this in and just sort of think about it and let it seep into your consciousness and your mental faculties, your sense of knowledge, right? Your epistemological faculties. So that'd be the only sort of warning I would give. Don't. The whole point of the soul is that it is immeasurable. That's the whole point. So trying to find a rational definition, I think he does, but that's as close as you're going to get. One little sentence. So without further ado, let's get into it. He says, this little subsection is called methodological considerations. He says, our exposition of the question of space and time, particularly with respect to their constitutive, role in latent or nascent form appropriate to the individual structures, indicated that further consideration of this question was needed if we are to understand the foundations of consciousness. One real quick, one last disclaimer. I apologize for getting this out a little later today. Usually I like to do it Monday afternoons, but I was just super busy today. So it'll be later. So if you're on the East Coast, it'll be around midnight when this goes up. I do apologize for that. Let's continue. Quote, the discovery that quote unquote time, of course, that is mental time. He says, the discovery that time, in our sense, is an instrument we have created with which we are able to shape the three-dimensional perspectival world and permit it to become a reality presents us with several suppositions. Inasmuch as the quote-unquote soul has a certain particular affinity to mythical temporicity, while thinking has an affinity primarily to space, it should be possible to infer certain conclusions with respect to the soul and thought that might parallel those which we drew for time and space. This is not to suggest that they are in any way identical, but we can expect nonetheless that those bearing on the soul will correspond to our conclusions about temporicity, those on thinking to our conclusion about space. So remember, in the space-time constitution of the structures, in the mythical, remember the discovery of time, so to speak, the 2D cyclical time, night and day, closing in on each other and completing each other, led rise to the discovery of the soul to be understood in that same manner. So also remember that Gebser says there is a connection between the mental consciousness structure and the magic consciousness structure. What is this connection? Why does it exist? The discovery, the preceding discovery that birthed these new structures were external. So of course in the magic structure it was nature, and then in the mental structure it was the objectified space. Whereas in the integral, or excuse me, in the mythical consciousness structure, the discovery was internal. It was the soul, or if you insist on rational terms, the psyche. Nonetheless, it was internal, and of course, when the soul was discovered, remember it's bound up with time. The soul and time were bound up together. What was the discovery that preceded the mutation of the integral consciousness structure? Of course, that would be time, a sort of abstract time, a real understanding of what time is, not the mental bastardization of it. So I think it's a lot of, I think when people talk about soul more and more nowadays, that's what they're getting at. The same time and soul relationship that was codified and sort of manifest in the mutation of the mythical consciousness structure. Well, if time and soul are tightly together and the discovery that preceded the integral structure is time, you're going to see more soul, which is to say spirit. We're going inwards again. Just an interesting connection I thought I made. Let's see. He continues, the conditionality of any multidimensional world concept is directly proportional to the possibilities which can be realized in it. Thus the mythical, paradoxical as it may seem, is tied to its lack of boundaries. Expressed in rational terms, it is the negative form of limitation which gives it its stamp. Consequently, the mental is tied to its limitation, although this does not prevent it from the perennial temptation to burst out of these boundaries in the form of a regression to irrationality or pre-rationality, or from a flight "forward" into the expanses of transcendentalism, or from a lack of knowledge as to its own temporal constitution, that, despite its clock-like nature, demonstrates a certain focused dynamism and energy which, when not perceived, has a destructive effect. So the rationalists, unfortunately, in dividing time, which is already a divider in their world, and in not understanding time as its own unique phenomena and trying to spatialize time, it's always going to lead to destruction. Why? Because I don't want to confuse you or overload you, but getting into the future a little bit, time we will see is a constitutive or creator of space. So when space tries to spatialize its own creator, you get nothing because space needs a preceding creator, which is time, but time has been transformed into space, and space cannot create its own space. Only time can do that. So there you go. Quote, this dynamism is destructive whenever left to itself and not treated commensurately with its nature as a directing factor that gives a spatial orientation to the spaceless. Wherever it is itself divided instead of being a divider, or is too markedly sectored, it destroys space, resulting in a negative spacelessness rather than an ordered direction. So kind of see what happens when the rationalists try to rationalize time and try to quantifiably measure and spatialize and determine the little time units like, oh, it's 10:40 p.m. and then soon it'll be 10:41. That's maybe a part of time, but not the whole thing. There are therefore good reasons for undertaking in this first part of our study the task of clarifying several important questions. First, the question as to quote unquote soul and spirit, and the question of quote forms of realization and thought. Now that will be in part 2. That's I think what's coming next. Beyond this, it is imperative to show the conditionality, temporal restrictions, and limitations of the individual structures, particularly of our present-day mental rational structure, if we are to gain a general view of the possibilities of the new consciousness. And, after our description of the predominantly spatial conditionality of the mental structure and the genesis of its spatial emphasis, it will surely have become obvious that there can, indeed there must be, a freedom from space-time in a new integral structure of consciousness. So we are freeing ourselves, a freedom from space-time. Wait, that's weird. Anyways, we'll continue. Maybe I'll return to that. That's kind of weird. He says, it is also our desire to clarify the extent and nature of the effects of the psyche, and to examine the possibility of an apsychic world, that is, a world freed from dependence on or enslavement to the psyche, in which the psyche is in consequence not negated, but rather becomes transparent. So apsychic world, think about what we're doing in my Kill Rationalism series. Think about what we're doing with irrationality. We're standing outside the bounds of it. It's a cliche, but I use it all the time. We are the fish that has been taken out of the water, and we are seeing, this is the water. This is my home my whole life. Now I can see from a different perspective or point of view, a more all-encompassing, what's really happening here. The stream of water has been rendered transparent. We're doing the same thing with the psyche. Now, of course, the psyche, the strong I, strong self, that was, of course, a product of, if the mental structure was born from the discovery of perspectivity, that is an objectified space that is externally, well, then there must be a corresponding subject to perceive the object. So this manifests in the strong I, in a psychological sense and a philosophical sense. The ability to perceive and to be aware you're perceiving. But here, the psyche controls things. The psyche, and it'll be interesting to see how he delineates psyche from the soul. I actually don't think he has yet, but I'm sure I'll get there. And think about what's happening. If we're standing outside the bounds of the psyche, which in many ways I didn't really think was possible, that signals to me that there is a deeper underlying power that can do that. That is to say, If you're standing outside of your psyche, you are not your psyche. There is an underlying, more potent power at play manifesting in you. I have a feeling that's going to be soul or whatever. Nonetheless, we're going to try to put the psyche away, or at least stand outside of it and render it transparent to confer new and more holistic and just simply better knowledge on it. It is also our intent to discover the nature and extent of the effects of rationality and materialism, and the possibilities of an irrational, amaterial world where the same holds true as in the case of the psyche. That is, where matter is not negated, but in fact becomes transparent. So in standing outside the psyche and standing outside of rationality, and I try to say this all the time, we're not tossing it aside entirely. We're not negating it. We're not stamping it out and saying you don't belong here anymore. We're just rendering it transparent so we can have a more holistic and accurate understanding of how it works, and we can free ourselves from dependence of it. Okay, he continues a little later on. He says, quote, "It is our hope that by dealing with these particular topics, we have sufficiently laid bare the foundations so that when approaching essentially quote unquote new manifestations, we will be able to distinguish those which are truly new from those of previous structures which are merely disguised in modern dress. To be able to do this, we must clarify for ourselves in each instance the specific dimension, vital conditionality, psychic temporal restrictions, and mental limitations inherent in them. Otherwise, we shall find ourselves wandering aimlessly in a labyrinth." So, really, just a brilliant guy. I mean, the fact that he can see all of this is just amazing. He continues, "Both the psychic and the mental structures (leaving aside the definitely entangling tendency of the magic vital structure), and particularly the rational structure, that is, the deficient form of its ambiguities, and the mental because of its sector-like multifacetedness." Oh, excuse me. I missed a sentence. Let me try that again. "Both the psychic and the mental structures, and particularly the rational structure, that is, the deficient form of the mental, are predisposed to delusions and will-o'-the-wisps, the psychic because of its ambiguities, and the mental because of its sector-like multifacetedness." So when I make claim that someone is rationalist is delusional, I don't use that word lightly, and the reason why is because there's two big reasons why the rationalists, and I only mention it because he mentioned it, would be deluded. One, he's deluded in the sense that he thinks anything that can be considered true by rational thought is exclusively true. That's delusional because it's limited, right? So it's by definition, it's not the whole. And another problem is, remember when we talked about the models? When I'm um, when I'm thinking about the world or an aspect of the world, I'm standing back, that is to say, establishing distance or space and thinking about it rather than directly engaging with it. Now, in this world of thought, I create models of what is being considered. Say it's my little mouse pad here. I don't have the consciousness of a mouse pad. I have the consciousness of a human being, of a Homo sapien. So I create models in my head that can be so I can attain to the furthest realistic extent the consciousness, so to speak, the inner workings or functions or how it's made, the telos of the mousepad. Taken too far, you become delusional. And the reason why you become delusional is because you've privileged in here over out there rather than seeing these as polar complements. And what you do is you are the engineer who's got all these great theories, and then when he tries it, the machine simply doesn't work. The engineer says, okay, back to the drawing board. The rationalist says, no, it's the machine's problem. It's the world's problem, not me. So that's where delusion sort of comes in. It's people who are dealing with a model of reality, which to a certain extent we all kind of are, but some are more accurate than others, quite frankly, and some are just completely destroyed. And then, of course, delusions in the psychic, that is to say, the psychological, which is what consciousness structure sort of birthed that. Of course, the mythical structure. There's so many symbols and so many different interpretations and so many myths and all these images, and especially when it becomes deficient and becomes overloading, the psyche becomes atomized. And of course, if you're atomized, you're not going to have a firm grasp on reality and what's happening. You're going to become delusional because you don't have any rationality to balance your emotion and your psychological just exertion of energy and images and all this stuff. So that's why I think they get sort of delusional for two separate reasons. He says, quote, apart from this, we are all subject to the temptations of our vital experience, of our visions, of our views. So vital experience, of course, magic, of our visions, mythical, and of our views, mental. These delude us. Uh, we pull them down. We weigh them too much. We assign them too much value, and we can't toss them out. Without these forms of realization, we cannot survive even for a day, since the structures on which they are based along with these forms of realization make up our integral constitution. It is the degree of our insight into and encompassing perception of them, or, more exactly, the degree that they become transparent for us, that transforms them into our instrument and prevents us from being their plaything. So the way how we attain power and in turn healthily channel the consciousness structures is to render them transparent, attain knowledge of them, and then balance them all into an integral whole. And then we can use one or the other or all of them based on discernments we make in the real world. But you have to have knowledge of what is happening here. If you do not have knowledge of uh, the mythical consciousness structure and you just sort of give in and it becomes, you stop controlling it and it starts controlling you in the same way that the rationalists have allowed the laws of logic to control them. Uh, they are not in charge. It's really rationality that's in charge. Well, same thing with the mythic, as it's it's the same thing. Um, if you give in too much to these psychic images, you're going to have a problem. Um, but these consciousness structures, which on Wednesday were like a ball and chain and dragged us down and created all these delusions for us and led us off all these cliffs, on Thursday can turn us into, like, not really, but gods. We have the full capacity of the enormity of the human condition at our disposal, and we can now channel it healthily. We can now balance these things and almost create a new world, and I think we probably will, just in the same way that the perspectival world was such a different world than the unperspectival world. Um, and of course, hopefully, we can improve these things, and we can improve civilizations, and we can all stop fighting. And maybe that'll be hundreds, thousands of years down the line, but you see the point. Um, Everything's about integral. Don't privilege a consciousness structure over the other. Balance them into an integral whole. Any attempt to describe the problematics of soul and spirit is fraught with risks, since we know that the soul alludes to a great extent a calculative, rational description, and that such an approach is incommensurate with the soul's immeasurable nature. But this is not the major difficulty. More significant is the difficulty posed by this immeasurability itself. Manifestations of the psyche are infinite. The material which must be sifted through is, in the final analysis, beyond our grasp, comparable to the flow and flux of the ever-changing water which runs through our hands, or to the incessant gusts of wind in the air. So what he's saying is, it's really difficult to have any sort of, now, because Gebser is a genius, and I mean that sincerely, he is able to quantifiably measurable to a very roughly a sufficient extent, for sure. It's not super deep, but that's the whole point. You're never going to be able to do that. He's able to quantifiably measure the immeasurable, so that applies to the soul. So he, with the help with help of others, and he sort of shouts them out, but he is the one who's saying, this is what's happening here. It's really, really kind of incredible when you think about it. But this is sort of him acknowledging that fact that this is, it's like you said, you want to put the rational calculation aside. Here, then, he continues, particularly here, it is necessary for us to make modest claims and not be taken in by the fascinations and enticements of the will-o'-the-wisps and the sheer wealth of manifestations, even though they give every appearance of revealing the explanation of their context. It is at the very moment when we are groping for a definite and specific result that such explanations imperceptibly elude our forceful grasp and revert to the darkness of their counterpole. So it's interesting, it says darkness of their counterpole. So the soul has to be balanced between the darkness of their counterpole and the lightness of their counterpole. If you try to move the soul to the lightness of their counterpole, which presupposes clarity, understanding, the ability to measure, to create an adequate definition of something, that's when it switches. I don't want to be too super repetitive, but that's the whole point. Don't get too lost in the rational understanding of this. From a rational standpoint, nowhere else is the possibility so great that a given statement will be so easily and quickly refuted by the appearance of its polar complement. We must therefore remain cognizant that what seems to us in rational terms to be an antithesis is in psychic terms a polarity. This polarity must not be severed by rational approach, nor should we allow ourselves to succumb to its ambiguity. So, with the soul, we will be deploying the mythical consciousness structure, and it makes sense because that, of course, was the preceding discovery that allowed the mythical structure to consolidate in our consciousness. 2D flat circle, baby, yin and yang. We do not privilege the yin over the yang or the yang over the yin. We do not view the yin as a negator of the yang and vice versa. Polar complements. No mental trinity. There are, then, two dangers inherent in any involvement or debate relating to this aspect of the world. The danger that we will destroy it by approaching it from a rational antithetical standpoint, and the danger that we become captive to it by our submission. What sort of possibility remains for us to gain an awareness of this aspect without the attendant perils? It is above all necessary for us to be cognizant of those structures which constitute us. That is to say, we need an approach of not only vital and psychic, but also mental discipline and confidence if we are to avoid the imminent peril. So the cool thing is, even though the mental structure is kind of antithetical to this, it does balance the unperspectable world, the magical and mythical structures, which is great because it allows us to establish even just a little bit of order. And that little bit of order goes a whole long way. Such self-discipline, which is more than mere wakefulness, provides the assurance or the chance to survive the adventure inherent in every previous attempt to measure oneself against the immeasurable. Simple hardy courage is not enough to assert itself against the unfathomable depths or the Icarus-like flights of the soul, and we must be equally on guard against mere half-hearted involvement. So anytime you're trying to find the soul, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be this slide in heaven where everything's nice and there's flowers everywhere. Everyone who takes this seriously warns about this. That's kind of the same warning that we talked about in an earlier video about ayahuasca. They're saying, be careful and know what you're going into. Our aid can be found in the discipline and assurance which, though generally only attainable from time to time, enable us to place the phenomena to be described in their proper place and order, as well as to incorporate them into their corresponding events and actualities. We are speaking of that self-discipline for which the somber lament of all creatures, the ambivalent imagery of the psyche, and the dissecting antithesis of thinking become transparent. He skips on a little ahead. It is from this point of departure that we wish to examine the immeasurable material at our disposal. And what is important is not the seductive multiplicity of phenomena, but rather the clarity of our range of vision. So don't get too lost on all the different imagery and symbols and representations of the soul and spirit. Now, for us, it's not too bad because Gebser is kind of done it for us. Now, of course, hopefully this inspires you to kind of look at myth and myth from the unperspectable world that time in a different way, and it totally has done that for me. It's completely changed things. But for us, it's a little different because Gebser's done the work for us. But of course, if we want to further investigate on our own these ancient myths, keep that in mind. Let's see. In order to avoid the dangers of intellectualization, we shall present the phenomena of soul and spirit from the standpoint of their history. Thereby these phenomena will find their appropriate place and order in our sense, in what is inherently a circular structure. We shall then examine the phenomenon history in the hope that we will be able to clarify afterward the phenomena of soul and spirit. If we are attentive above and beyond this to the perils which can emerge from the other structures, our integral attentiveness will, in the best sense of the word, truly quote unquote sustain us in the face of their danger. So we have to quickly go over history, and then this next section is called the numinusum, mana, and the plurality of souls. So we're not going to finish this entire section today, but we should get a little into it. The first part of this study bears the subtitle, quote, a contribution to the history of the awakening of consciousness. But wherever we encounter historical topics, we are definitely in the mental structure. Interesting. Magic, even mythical man, is without quote unquote history. The Egyptians of old knew only of annals and or chronicles, not of historicity. If we are to speak, then, of a history of the phenomena of soul and spirit, as we spoke earlier of a history of perspective, we must be clear as to the meaning of the word history. I've always said the mark of an intelligent man is to separate signifier from signified. So history is just a word, just like any other word, and a word is a symbol, which is just an image or a sound meant to communicate another idea. You will be shocked how many debates you listen to, and these very intelligent people stumble at the first hurdle because they simply cannot get past the semantic definition of a word. Anytime that happens to me, take socialism and capitalism, for example. That's not real socialism. That's not real capitalism. If this ever happens to me, I always say, what word would you like to come up with that describes this economic system so we can overcome this hurdle? And if I need to call it bapitalism or mapitalism, I'll do it. Just do that. Separate signifier from signified. And if you're trying to come to a rational understanding, try to focus more on the signified, not the signifier. That's why Gebser is the man. He says, over the past several decades, the philosophy of history has furnished a number of approaches whose rationalistic speculations are not devoid of a certain charm, but in the last analysis, they turn out to be one-sided. Real quick, he says, philosophy of history, my sort of unofficial mentor, John David Ebert, at his John David Ebert School of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts. He has a class on the philosophy of history. He is an expert in Spengler. He does Toynbee. He does all these guys. So please go check out John's class. I can speak for it. It's great stuff. Carl Joel's conception, for example, definitely borders on a biological mythical attitude, since he maintains that for history to be history, it must elapse in periods. Now, I don't know Carl Joel or his conception of history. I'm not going to lie to you. But if he does believe that history, let's see, must elapse in periods. Now, of course, the connection to the mythical structure is always going to be there, right? The cyclical, the 2D, the period of midnight and midday, they are the two poles. So if everything's cyclical, well, of course, cyclical is a circle, and that is the symbol that represents the mythical consciousness structure. So interesting. A different approach is pursued by vitalists like Spengler, who place the power principle at the forefront of their conception of history, evidence of their predominantly magical thinking. Very, very, very interesting stuff. Now, as I just said, John is the expert. John David Ebert is the expert in Spengler. I've learned a little bit from him, and I have a very pop basic understanding. So what Spengler's idea is that civilizations go through a lifespan, a life cycle. It's about 1,000 years, and he draws an analogy to the four seasons. So there's always a spring, which is the beginning, the summer, which is we're starting to get going, this culture is building, and then we have fall, which is the peak, the prime, the apotheosis, so to speak. This is great high thinking, great high art, great high religion, great high spirituality, all this stuff. And then we have winter, which is the decline phase, which is actually the civilizational phase, which is counterintuitive. So when a culture or a people's makes the switch from exactly that culture to civilization, what is happening is intensivity is being traded for extensivity. That is to say that spiritual pursuits, ethical concerns, religious ideas, deep philosophical ideas, these are being traded for money, power, uh, uh, politics, political concerns, stuff like that, building rational considerations. Now, of course, when we make the change from culture to civilization, Spengler reminds us that we're switching from the gods to materialist atheism, that is to say, rationalism, and that is the beginning of the end of a civilization. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but America really is kind of right on, right on cue with this narrative here. It's a very fascinating narrative. It's taught me a ton. Uh, but notice how, like I said, it's a lifespan. It is a life cycle. Well, life is what? Vitality. That, my friend, is magical thinking. Um, that's an aspect of the magical consciousness structure. So Spangler's as great as his book is, and I actually asked John about this when I interviewed him. If you want to check that out on his channel, he actually agreed with this criticism. So it's very interesting. He continues, and Benedetto Croce or Croce, whose conception derives mainly from Vigo and Hegel, divorces history in a strictly intellectualized manner from any connection with irrational events, while at the same time basing it on the unity of thought and deed. Yet every thought, as an act of intention, is primarily mental, and every deed, as a unitary act resulting from a union, is predominantly magic. For this reason alone, they cannot undergo a synthesis in the intellectualized history a la Croce, as such a synthesis is a suspension of thought and deed in favor of quote-unquote history. That is, unless one would err by assuming that these three components, thought, deed, and history, are in their interworkings merely a kind of continuous process. By its denial or exclusion of the mythical reality, so important to Vico, such vitalism or voluntarism results in a falsification or simplification of a theory history. So you're trying to rationalize all these magical concepts. That's problem number one. Problem number two, you've ignored the mythical conscious structure as well. So little critique of Vico. Vico. He says these and similar theories of history appear to have individually only a partial validity. Real quick, remember this opening. Um, Wherever we encounter historical topics, we are definitely in the mental structure. Now, mental is, of course, limited. Everything about mental structure and rational thought is limited. It can only derive a limited truth. So when he says these and similar theories of history appear to have individually only a partial validity, that's the problem with all these rational histories. They only deduce a limited truth. That's not necessarily a problem as long as you are cognizant of that, but of course people are not. They think it's the whole. If you can combine all these philosophies and take all these truths and combine them into an integral whole, now we're talking. But that's not happening. And the same thing with philosophy as well. And it reminds me of that quote from Nietzsche, who said, "Don't worry about the house that the philosopher builds." And he phrased this a little differently. Just focus on the bricks they use to make it. So that is to say, don't necessarily take in everything a philosopher has to say, but all these great philosophers, they do press upon at least a limited truth. And of course, that limitation is inherent in the rational mode of thought that they are employing. Um, so always keep that in mind. It manifests not just in logic, it manifests in other perspectival domains, domains of perspectival thought. So math, history, philosophy, all sorts of stuff. Quote, it does not matter whether we speak of a history of nations or peoples, of philosophy, or of the soul, for in every instance the visible or invisible events which in some way determine one another are arranged in one time sequence. As a result, even contemporary political historians frequently make the error of relying on the inevitably power-oriented events and ignore the inconsequential, the quote-unquote uneventful periods in which the truly eventful actions occur. So real quick, he says, for in every instance, the visible or invisible events which in some way determine one another are arranged in one time sequence. What did I just say about the limitations? Everything's limited. So it's taking time and it's limited. Time has a wide variance and a lot of diversity of manifestations. It could be relativity, it could be duration, it could be clock time, it could be all sorts of stuff. They've only limited. They've limited it to one. It's one time sequence. So usually duration. That's usually what it is. Big, big, big problem. Everything is limited, and this is one of the limitations there. And now, when you do that, Gebser says, you end up sort of privileging the vital, how does he describe it? The power-oriented events. So wars, genocides, um, all these really terrible abdications, kings getting their head cut off, stuff like that. This way of understanding history has been very influential for me. I mean, I definitely understood history in that way. I kind of fell into that bias, and I'm not saying I don't still do it now, but it really has informed my worldview. this sort of the tragic view I take on, that we are tragically limited as humans. Both there are inherent limitations in human nature, but also limitations that nature imposes on us. That was certainly informed by this sort of privileging of the power-oriented events in history, this sort of rational deficient. I'm not saying you should toss this out, but later on in part 2, we're going to be doing more integral understanding of the philosophy of history. So that'll be cool. Quote, essential to such history are the coronations, abdications, wars, treaties, and revolutions, an extremely one-sided, perspectivistic, and materialistic emphasis. This common and widespread form of historiography is dominated primarily by the masculine point of view of power. Even where it inquires as to quote-unquote strengths or forces, it reifies the non-substantial factors. Its approach is appropriately perspectivistic, and in spite of all calculations, it does not take this form of calculation into account. So it is a very sort of patriarchal understanding of history, focusing on brute strength, power, masculinity. You're not getting that softer, emotional, immeasurable feminine side, which is necessary if one wants to have a more integral, holistic understanding. And then he says it's perspectivistic, and of course, perspectivistic thought calculates, but that's the great irony about rationalism and perspectival thought going too far. It calculates everything except for itself. And if it did, it would realize it should stop calculating everything. Quote, the same may be said of historical writing on subjects from the sciences of the mind or of the humanities where dates, particles of time, have the principal role. In an inquiry into the history of the phenomena of soul and spirit, it may at first glance seem contradictory that these phenomena are linked to the word history, especially as the soul, in particular, is a temporistic and not a temporal phenomenon, and temporality would seem to be the first requisite for anything having to do with history. Nonetheless, it is permissible to speak of a quote-unquote history of these phenomena, as the word itself may suggest. History, oh, this is going to be rough. Geschichte, that's German, Geschichte, is not just quote-unquote occurrence, Geskechen, Geshchen, but also what has occurred. Inasmuch as we base our interpretation on both these aspects, it has a validity conferred on it by Theodore Lessing. The title for his book on history was suggested by a friend, and this friend has furnished us with the key. His title, History as the Attribution of Sense to Senselessness. That is what he means by history. Very simple, beautifully put. History as the attribution of sense to the senseless. So part of this is going to be directing. We are directing sense to the senseless. Now, of course, directed thought is mental structure, which reminds us of the opening sentence where he said, when you have history, you're in the mental consciousness structure. We're seeing that direction, so important to the mental structure, manifest in history. He says, as we noted earlier, such attribution of quote-unquote sense includes also a direction. In this sense, history gives, or we allow it to give, direction to the directionless. If we perceive history in this way, it becomes integral rather than one-sidedly magic, mythical, or mental. Hold on real quick. It becomes integral rather than one-sidedly magic, mythical, or mental. But why? It does not exclude directionlessness as a phenomenon and is based not only on comprehensible and palpable dates, but also on the dateless. Beautiful. He just sums it up so succinctly. I love it. So in history as the attribution of sense to the senselessness, notice how senselessness has its own place. Not only is there sense, of course, we are assigning direction and attributing sense to the senseless, but we are also acknowledging that, hey, the senseless not only exists, but it makes up, so to speak, a large aspect of what it is we're considering here. So that's why I mentioned in a video earlier in this series, when you're engaging with history, you always have to be cognizant of the fact that this is only what has been recorded and that what we know. There is a whole world behind this history that has happened, and it was incredibly effectual, and that you need to take into account, but you can't because you don't have the knowledge to do so because there are limitations. the unperspectable world, the consciousness structures, the magic mythical, were not conducive towards history. That was the mental. So unfortunately, we're working with the best with what we have. Now, for all you history guys out there, this is not me attacking history as a subject. I love history as a subject. I think it's amazing. I think we should learn from it, obviously. That's what Gebser's doing. Gebser, if he's not a historian proper, I mean, the dude clearly knows he's a historian. I mean, the dude knows what he's talking about. He clearly loves history, but you always be cognizant of that. Don't be aware of that rationalist bias where one, you're not showing respect to the sensible in the sense that you're not acknowledging that it exists, and two, you are making everything sensible. Everything has to be sensible. You have no way of just saying, not only do we not know, but there's some senselessness here. Okay. There is, accordingly, more than one affinity between history in our sense and what we have defined as the awakening of consciousness. In this, history is divested of its mere temporality and sequential nature and assumes its place within the mutational structure. So temporality and sequential nature, this sort of chronological duration, that's one manifestation of time, not the only one. Don't limit it to just one. Okay. He says the circumstance can, this is interesting, the circumstance can even be even more strongly integrated. For instance, the meaning of quote unquote giving direction is originally inherent in both the word history and the German word Geschichte, that Geschichte, without restricting this directing to man as an agent. So giving direction was inherent in both history and the German word for history. So that direction there is manifest, but as he says, it doesn't restrict this directing to man as an agent. What does he mean by that? He says the word history, which is derived from the Greek historia, is based on the Greek verb historio, meaning, quote, to inquire after something, and thus conveys a clear expression of being directed. We are inquiring after something. Our thoughts are directed toward the thing that we are inquiring. The German word Geschichte, conveyed originally the sense of providence, coincidence, event, and is an emphatic form of Old and Middle High German Geschichte, Geschicht, a derivation of sehen, Scehen, meaning, quote, to occur by means of a higher providence. The word Geschichte is thus clearly an intensified form of a participle, of the root word Geskehen, Geschen, to occur. So Geschichte and Geskehen, Geach, they're clearly deriving from the same root. Remember the digression, it's not really a digression, on the unity of the root of primal words. The word was supposed to represent a unity of concepts or ideas, if you want to call them that, or associations, whatever they were doing back then. Rationally speaking, a word has one meaning, so that A equals A and not A equals A and B at the same time. This is a mouse key. This can only be a mouse key. It's not a mouse key and a tree at the same time. But of course, this is sort of a bastardization of etymology. You're limiting it, and you're not understanding the structures and the words and the way they were used on their own terms. You're kind of destroying history in that sense. And when he says, so when you see the commonality of the root Geskikta, Gesch, and Gesch in both Geskikta and Gesik or Geskikt, you have to know that this is expressing a unity of concepts. Now, unity, according to rational analysis, would be considered a contradiction. It is not a contradiction. It is a unity, and we're about to see how he puts it together. He said the word Geskikta is thus clearly an intensified form of a participle of the root word Geskehen, to occur. This intensified sound is accompanied by an intensification of meaning, that is, it addresses not just any occurrence, but a very special one. And this intensification of meaning points to a noteworthy fact, something which of itself is directed at us, since it is quote unquote sent by providence, is not just a common but rather a special providence. Behind this sense of something special, we can detect a numinous background. So, key points here. He says Historia is Geskikta. or history, excuse me, or Geschichte, and then derives from historia, which derives from historio, which means to acquire after something, which is direction. So with Geschichte means providence, correspondence, or providence, coincidence, event. Sorry, I'm looking at my little note here. Gesicht or Geschichte, which means to occur by means of a higher providence, man's directs and is directed. So in the unity of the root of the primal word, Gesch, is both directing for man as an agent, I am directing, but also events in the world that have their own autonomous agency that are so profound, coincidental, or providential are directing themselves onto me and my sense perception. So you can see the integral aspect of the direction. We are both directing and being directed upon, rather than the rational understanding, the limited understanding of man being the only thing that directs. Um, interesting idea, and it's expressed in the root words there. The root was expressed in two different words, which express two kind of antithetical meanings. But again, if you understand them on their own terms, you can understand and have a more holistic idea of what's happening, and in turn, more accurate understanding. He says, recollection has a decisive role in the formation of history. Let us for the moment disregard the role of memory within the emergent awareness of what we call history. We will have occasion to speak of the memory symbolized by the muses in the context of another kind of history called poetry. I actually haven't gotten there in the book yet. But both these forms of history, history in quotes there, to the extent that they are qualitative history and not merely a sequence of dates or words, have in common an immanent quality of recollective internalization and the corresponding externalization of utterance. So in both history proper or history more traditional sense, your Spanglers, your Toynbees, all those guys, we are both recollecting and externalizing. If you remember, this is exactly what we did with myth. We are internally looking and seeing, and then externally and audibly putting to word what has been seen. These are not contradictions. They only are viewed as contradictions if no longer viewed correctly as polar complements, but instead incorrectly as rational dualistic antitheses. Same thing with history. We are recollecting and then externalizing in the form of books or discussion or whatever. So remember, putting the rational aside here. A process of the awakening of consciousness with mythical overtones is discernible in this reciprocal interplay of recollection and its externalization. So there you go, there's the mythical right there. Whether they are visible events as in history or invisible events of poetry, if you will, they must be recollected, that is, mutely absorbed and internalized before they can be externalized in the form of speech or report. So poetry is its own sort of history, whereas history is recording, so to speak, or attributing sense to the senseless, which is probably a better way of putting it, of what has happened externally in the past and present. Poetry does it with the soul. It is a history of the soul. It is attributing a sense to the senselessness. We are understanding and measuring and playing and living with the emotions, the feelings, the immeasurable romance of man, and we're attributing sense to the senseless in that respect. So pretty cool connection there. He says the internalization of memory and the externalization of utterance as constituents of the poetic process in its broadest sense will be examined in the second part of the book. It would seem that the creative process, hitherto predominantly psychic, is beginning to undergo a transposition or displacement to another zone. Okay, so before we get into the numinosum, I think we'll stop there. I want to thank you guys so much for continuing to watch. I love you guys more than anything. Let's see. So as I'm getting more and more into the second book of Gebser, and I've really only wet my beak. I'm still reading it, but it's so good. I love Gebser so much. It's pretty obvious what the structure of this book is becoming. So part one is really just an outline of the structures, the soul, the space-time constitution of the structures, all the stuff that we covered. We're really just outlining these things. And then that'll be the same here on the history of the phenomena of soul and spirit. Don't get too upset if we get to the end of this section and you still feel a little dissatisfied, like, okay, that's nice, but let's let's liven it up. Let's get some examples. That'll all be coming in the second part of the book. The second part of the book seems to be one, we're going to be getting into time a lot more. We're going to be understanding time, and we're going to be getting into the forms of realization. So that is when, now that we have the outlines, let's connect the dots. Let's fill in the dots, fill in the blank spaces, and we'll be good. So I love you guys to death. Thank you for continuing to watch. I'm planning on doing another video this week. It's not going to be a kill rationalism video. It's not going to be a Gebser series video, I don't think. I might do another one this week. But it'll be fun. It's definitely Gebser related. And it'll be fun. It'll be interesting, and I'm excited for you guys. I actually did the notes for it months ago, but I decided to do my movie videos instead. I'll probably do one of those later too. So keep your eye on that. Let me know if you guys thought this was a good lecture, and I'll see you guys in the next video. I'm super excited. We'll be talking about the numinous experience, and that's pretty cool. So I love you guys. You guys are the best.